Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be with you virtually. Everything is virtual these days. Just to explain a bit for those that you don't know me, who I am and why I'm sort of interested in this. Although on the first slide, you'll see I'm at the Bartlett School of Planning, UCL. I'm not actually on the payroll now. I'm effectively kind of retired in the sense that I'm not actually paid by anybody. And I do some lecturing and work with them on research occasionally. But in terms of what I've done in the past, I mean, I worked in London boroughs for 10 years in housing policy. Then I used to run the Housing Corporation program in London, the investment program in the days that it was mainly about social rent. And then in the early 2000s, I worked for Ken Livingstone and led on the housing elements of the London plan. And for the last 10 years or so, I've been teaching, but also doing a lot of lobbying. Mainly teaching on planning, but also on housing as well, because my interest has always been the interrelationship between housing and planning. So I'm going to start off by sort of giving a little bit of the background and talk about where the government is. I mean, the context from a housing point of view, you'll be fairly familiar with. I'm also using some of this material in presentations I'm doing for Labour Housing Group, and also I'm doing a session with the London Assembly Planning Committee in a week or so's time. So some of this, in a sense, will be fairly obvious to you, certainly in terms of the historic problems. So you can just kind of read this. I don't need to run through it, because obviously, you know, the collapse of housing investment, the end of the social rented housing programme, you know, 30, 40 years of right to buy are familiar to you. From the planning side, we've had policies of some restraint on availability of sites, which in the London context has been problematic and forced a lot of high density development. But the main constraints have been the combination of greenbelt protection and the failure of the housing authorities outside London to make a contribution to the citywide regional needs. One of the networks I run is actually on strategic planning in London and the wider southeast. I should also say that for the last 12 years or so, I've been running a network, a sort of professional academic network on housing supply, which obviously picks up planning. And I've sent the draft submissions to Sharon, which are the submissions that group, the Hyper Group on Housing Delivery, is submitting on both consultation papers. Part of the background is the government and historic government's false assumption that the simple solution to housing affordability is building more market homes. We all know how wrong that is, and I'm still staggered, not just how many ministers still believe that's the solution, obviously one that the private developers like, but actually still quite a lot of academics still take that view. It all goes back to the 2004 Barker review. And this has very much been the thinking of government policy, that just increasing housing numbers has kind of a trickle down effect, which is bluntly complete nonsense. And we can discuss that later. What we've also seen, though, is a significant planning deregulation. So what the government is proposing is effectively an extension of planning deregulation. The main deregulation we've seen in recent years is, of course, the introduction of permitted development, which has led to the conversion of office blocks into housing and producing very low standard housing in many cases. We're also in a sort of planning vacuum in London, where the government has failed to agree with the mayor, or the mayor has failed to agree with government, whichever way you want to put it, any London plan. And therefore there's a situation where we've got a very out-of-date strategic plan for London, and it's unclear whether we're actually going to see a revised London plan and what housing figures are going to be in them before the deferred mayoral election next spring. I've been trying to find out both from the GLA and central government what is actually happening, and nobody's really prepared to go public on this at the moment, probably because there's other things to focus on. But as we'll discuss later, the planning white paper does have major implications for strategic planning in London and the role of the London plan. Interestingly, the planning white paper doesn't mention strategic planning or actually London at all. And we're waiting to see whether the devolution white paper, which is due out fairly soon, which we understand is going to completely reform local government outside London, what the implications for London are. There are certainly implications in it for the relationship between London and the wider southeast. So what are the government objectives? Focusing on, as I say, increasing housing output overall, with no real concern for the type of housing, its location, and certainly no focus on affordability. This is going to be achieved through deregulation, and very significant deregulation relative to the planning system, which is primarily based on the 1947 Act, forms of speeding up planning processes, but also an obsession with digitization. I'm not going to talk much about digitization. There are some positive aspects of it, but there are issues of, if any form of consultation relies on people having access to computers, that in itself is actually can be quite limited. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the short-term proposals. This is the short-term consultation paper, was called Consultation on Changes to the Current Planning System. And as you can see there, the deadline for responses is the 1st of October, only a week or so away. Now, one of the critical elements of this, and the one that's getting most publicity, is the new approach to housing targets. Following what's been happening on the education side, everybody's now using the term algorithm, but it's effectively changing the current housing needs assessment formula. Now, the existing formula is a mixture, and this is the formula which sets housing targets for individual planning authorities. So at least theoretically, it's for individual London boroughs, though currently the London plan targets, which are on a different basis, override that. But the existing formula is a combination of trend-based population projections and a market affordability criteria. And this is based on, as I say, the notion that if you increase housing supply overall, new housing supply, that actually increases affordability through access to home ownership. It's purely a unit figure and doesn't therefore relate either to the type of housing or to the actual affordability of housing in terms of the range of needs amongst income groups. The proposal that's come forward is actually to modify that formula. There's some adjustments to the market affordability measure, but there's also the introduction of a sort of proportionate development target based on 0.5% of the existing stock in an authority. The logic for this is bizarre. The whole idea is that, I suppose, is that you replace every home every 200 years. But obviously the housing we've got doesn't last that long. But this formula does not relate in any way to employment growth or decline, or effectively, or in a sense, to future migration patterns, which may be very different from past migration patterns. So as a methodology for setting or even assessing housing needs at local authority level, it's grossly inadequate and has produced very, very high figures in some authorities and much lower figures than existing figures in authorities often well away from London. The basis of it, from the government's point of view, that it's a way of distributing what was a predetermined national housing target of 300,000 a year. The consequence of this is it actually produces a 93,000 a year figure for London, which is much higher than the 66,000 housing needs assessment from the last London Strategic Housing Market Assessment. It also produces very high figures for local authorities in the home counties, some of which probably do actually reflect a much higher housing need than's been accepted before, but are very difficult to justify in terms of a nationally driven formula. Historically, in London, we've assessed housing needs through the housing market assessment, which has been based originally on housing surveys. So the last housing survey in London of any size was actually undertaken in 2001, 2002. Housing need surveys, of course, identify backlogs of housing need. They can assess homelessness. They can incorporate data from waiting lists, however inadequate that data now is. But they can also identify the need for different types of housing at different levels of affordability and tenures. The proposed formula, similar to the last formula, ignores the whole issue of development capacity. So the targets in London are actually based on the assessed development capacity in each borough through a London-wide Strategic Housing Land Availability Assessment, or SHLA. All authorities across the country should have been doing their SHLAs, but there's very limited guidance from central government. So most SHLAs are in very different methodology. And just like SHMAs, you can't add up all the district figures and say that is a regional or a national picture. The government in the planning white paper, which we'll come on to in a moment, does actually recognise there is a little bit of problem with an algorithm which has no relationship to capacity. And very bizarrely, there's actually a question saying, how do we introduce a concept of development capacity actually into the formula? The risk that the adjustment they'll make is just taking into account previous development output or planning consents, perhaps, which of course don't necessarily relate to any consistent approach to development capacity and the deliverability of that development capacity. So there's been lots of revolts right across the country against this new algorithm, and the government is clearly in major difficulty with a lot of its own MPs and a lot of local authorities, because if you're, for example, a councillor in Sevenoaks, you're not going to appreciate the proposal that your housing output should be increased by a factor of 3 when 90% of your borough or your district is green belt protected. The second short-term proposal is this notion of first homes, a system basically of subsidy to developers and a requirement to local authorities to produce sub-market homes with basically a fixed proportion required in each local authority, and also the notion of a minimum level of subsidy with the potential for the local authority to increase so a minimum level of discount, which effectively is a form of subsidy, with also an indication that a local authority could actually increase that level of discount. Clearly, to get market homes way down the income scale, you would need a level of discount of kind of 70, 80 or 90% against market price. That's not proposed. The real risk of this is that, of course, it takes both supply and any indirect subsidy through Section 106 agreements or any other arrangements away from more affordable social housing, such as social rent. The groups I've worked with have always been opposed to the notion of a nationally imposed minimum target, because it should be for the local authority to determine, based on their housing needs assessment and their political priorities, what the targets for different types of provision should be. And if your supply is well below your overall demand, there clearly is a strong case for the majority, if not 100%, of new development being for social rent. The third proposition in the short-term proposals is put under the term of supporting medium-sized developers, and that is basically by changing the affordable housing requirement threshold and raising it from 10 to 50. This doesn't necessarily mean that it would, all that new development would be by medium-sized developers. In the London context, schemes of up to 50 units can make a lot of profit for a larger developer and are worth them undertaking. But what this basically does is reduce the affordable housing output quite significantly. The government kind of accepts that, but thinks it's worth doing in order to increase the overall housing output on small sites. I've always argued for a much lower affordable housing requirement threshold, in fact, even down to 0, because some sites on very high value sites, one private development could actually subsidize 2 or 3 social rented units. And then there's this proposal to extend permission in principle. This is similar to outline planning consent, but it's the notion of general consent being given, and then the applicant basically sorting out the details with the local authority later. This only applies to small sites at present, but the proposal here is to extend it to larger sites. The planning white paper has much more radical proposals on extending permission in principle, which I'll come on to in a moment. But those are the sort of four issues within the short-term proposals and the sort of immediate consultation deadline. Some of those measures, of course, would then be overridden by the more radical system being introduced by the planning white paper. So I will now move on to the planning white paper. This very much derives from the government's ideological position I started with, but rather oddly, well, perhaps not oddly now, the way government works, is this comes primarily from work by certain think tanks, but also the review apparently was led by Dominic Cummings, and there are clear issues in terms of whether the civil servants in the department, MHCLG, are really behind this in terms of how it would actually work in practice. I did listen to a seminar earlier in this week by Michael Bingham, who's one of the leads in the department on this, who's making it very clear that actually this isn't really a white paper. White papers are supposed to be very specific proposals. This is a very kind of open-ended consultation paper, and the civil servants certainly acknowledge they have to work out a lot of the details on the implementation and are actually asking for our help on how to do that. Many of us are actually saying that's problematic because this is not a starting point. So it's not really an issue what here we can amend to make better. There are issues about this being such a fundamental change that it represents effectively an abandonment of the planning system based on the 1947 legislation and subsequent modifications. So why is this so dramatic a change? And this is actually what the government is saying. So from my perspective, I'm not really overstating this. What they want to do is simplify the local plan making system. This is the local authority led system with which we're all very familiar. What they wish to do is take out a lot of the policy content, which they see as duplicating what comes from central government. And every time you have an examination in public on a local plan, you have an argument between the local authority and central government as to what can be changed, what supplements national guidance, and what is seen as conflicting and contradictory. But what they're actually proposing is that the soundness tests are modified, so you don't actually need all the evidence requirements that are required at present. So things like sustainability appraisals are going to be very, very much simplified, though we don't know how. But the issue about having your housing market assessment or even your strategic housing land availability assessment, we're not clear that those are still going to be required. So how a local authority is supposed to justify its local plan on the basis of being, on an evidence base and being sound, never mind actually being deliverable, that is all very unclear. The basic proposition is that each local planning authority creates or basically divides its authority area into three zones: a growth zone, a renewal zone, and a protected zone. The notion here is that it is only in the protected zone that the current development management system operated by a local authority will continue. The notion is that in either a growth or renewal zone, and one of the proposals in the planning white paper, or at least questions asked, is should the same policies be applied in both, is that any application that is consistent with the zone, i.e. it is growth or renewal, is actually given automatic planning consent. The government is using the term planning in principle here, but my understanding from civil servants is that the process will be similar to the outline consent process, which is not really used very often. There is a notion that local authorities may be able to designate sub-areas, but the only references in the planning white paper to sub-areas are sub-areas for town centres or for community-led development. What is unclear is whether a sub-area designation can be more specific about what kind of land uses are appropriate, housing, shopping, or employment, for example, because at present it applies that sort of effectively within a growth zone, anything will go that a developer proposes, and the local authority will only be able to involve themselves in matters of detail. So the notion here is bluntly that once the local authority writes its plan, which will be, subject to consultation, member involvement, as well as the officer involvement, that is basically really the end of both public consultation and local authority member and officer involvement. So it's very unclear at present how the actual approval of details will be determined within the local authority, whether members will have a say, and whether there will be any public consultation at all. So from your perspective, I think this is probably the most worrying aspect. Civil servants are still saying that they really haven't worked out yet how land use allocations and determinations between individual land uses will actually operate in practice. What I'm going to come back to is the issue of the relationship of a development management system to the to design codes and the building beautiful approach, which is treated as a completely separate issue in the planning white paper. This does actually have implications, though it's unclear, for the mayor's strategic development management function. The Mayor of London is the only sort of second-tier agency which effectively operates a power of veto and a power of takeover over major schemes. And major schemes are actually defined at actually quite a low level. So if the local planning authority is only able to get involved in the detailed decisions, given outline consent will be automatic, there is a question of what will be referable to the mayor at all, and what the role of the London plan will actually be, especially since the planning white paper proposes that development management policies be primarily set at a national level through a national design code, though that could be supplemented by some local design code. But whether there will be any sort of officer or member level discretion at a local authority level on this is still unclear. I think City Hall may be working on the assumption that the current referral arrangements will still operate because the planning white paper doesn't actually mention the mayor's role. But that's something I'm certainly going to be discussing with the London Assembly Planning Committee at their forthcoming meeting. That approach, as I've just described, is referred to as Pillar 1. Rather curious terms. People used to refer to the pillars of the welfare state, and whether the housing pillar was a wobbly pillar or not. Some of you may well be familiar with some writing using that terminology. That's the last time I've actually come across the use of the term pillar when establishing a new framework for delivery of a public sector service. Although obviously you could raise questions about whether this is actually a public sector service anymore. Anyway, the Building Beautiful proposition, which actually comes from the Building Beautiful Commission, which was chaired by Sir Roger Scruton before he died, is a sort of concept that really is running with government, and they seem kind of far more interested in the notion of good design from the architectural perspective than they are about planning policy and needs for local development assessed through sort of local surveys and the policy compliance side of things. So the government seems to be proposing that it is a national design code that is going to be the basis of a local authority determination on the details of a specific development proposal, but there is really an issue about who determines and assesses, well, who determines the design code at national or local level, and who actually assesses compliance, whether it is mandatory or advisory. We often talk about the British planning system as a discretionary system and contrast it with a zoning system, which is actually mandatory. My own view is that the distinction between the two is grossly overstated, and that what we actually have in Britain is a system where there is a planning framework set through a national planning guidance and a local plan, but there is a degree of discretion within that framework for local authorities to make actual planning decisions. Michael Bingham of the department on Monday at this other seminar referred to the fact that actually the proposal is not a zoning system per se, but is actually a hybrid system. So I think they're kind of backing off somewhat from the whole idea that this is actually going to be a greatly simplified system where the rules are set and there is very limited flexibility in relation to the rules that have been set. But clearly, if the zoning system is very broad, the rules are actually going to be quite minimal, and the ability of the local authority to intervene is going to be problematic. But what I think is going to happen is we will see the urban designers, and apologies to those of you listening who see themselves as urban designers, because my own view remains that the whole issue of what is beautiful from an urban design term is incredibly subjective. Everybody has a different view, whereas actually the planning policy requirements that we set can be set on an evidence base in a way that actually can be assessed. You can actually say that this scheme complies with this policy, doesn't comply with that policy, and then negotiate the changes you want. The government is in the process of setting up a new National Design Advisory Unit, and they have already commissioned some researchers at URBED, in fact, to work on a new national design code. What is really curious about the proposals, and this is the only attempt to link Pillar 2, Building Beautiful, with Pillar 1, the reformed planning system, is a proposal for a fast track scheme for beautiful schemes. This I find bizarre in the sense of who would actually determine whether a scheme was beautiful and was basically put through the planning system very quickly. And many schemes that some would see as beautiful, of course, completely fail to actually meet the policy requirements, either in terms of standards or in terms of affordability or in terms of size of dwelling. That's just focusing on the housing aspect. So, I mean, I was involved in some of the discussions on the margins of the Building Beautiful Commission. There was a planning working party, and my point was always that quality is absolutely critical, both internal and external quality of development, quality of services that are actually provided that residents have access to, but for quality has to be meaningful. Otherwise, you cannot include a measurement of quality in a system. There has to be a form of standards and a form of measurement, other than just half a dozen different people saying, I think this is beautiful, I don't think this is beautiful. And I must admit, I had enough of those ridiculous discussions in my time working with in City Hall. So the third pillar is community infrastructure levy and what happens to Section 106. What the government is actually proposing is a new infrastructure levy, which brings together the current community infrastructure levy and the Section 106 system. As I'm sure many of you are aware, Section 106, community infrastructure levy receipts cannot be used to fund affordable housing, where Section 106 is still used by most authorities as a way of basically topping up funding for affordable housing, whether it's social rent or shared ownership or discounted market sale. Over the recent years, far more of the Section 106 money has actually gone into discounted market sale and shared ownership than into social rent. But certainly when I was at City Hall, we were using the Section 106 negotiations on the strategic schemes to maximise the contribution to social rented housing. What the government is proposing is a standard national value-based rate of infrastructure levy. At present, a local authority can set its own rate of infrastructure levy, and the variations between adjacent local authorities, quite significant variations in terms of the kind of levy per unit of housing or per square metre of residential development. That is obviously a problem for developers who, may adjust their activity between authorities depending on the rate of levy. The difficulty with that system is that there's no relationship to the specific scheme economics. Section 106, of course, at least in theory, was about scheme-related mitigation, or raising money through Section 106 for the infrastructure requirements, and that can be social infrastructure as well as transport infrastructure, which relate to the specific scheme, but also as a way of ensuring that the scheme contributes to whatever the affordable housing target in the local authority's policy has been. The process used in both the mayor and in most local authorities for determining the level of Section 106 has been through a process of viability assessments. I was one of the team at City Hall that introduced viability assessments in the early 2000s at the time of the initial London Plan of 2004, which was used as a way of maximising the contribution from the developer to affordable housing, primarily to social rented housing. In the last 10 years or so, viability assessments have been widely regarded by, dare I say, the community sector as actually a bad thing, because what's actually been happening is that all the developers pay their consultants to produce a viability assessment which demonstrates to the local authority that they aren't actually making that much profit, and the local authorities, in many cases, have not had sufficient knowledge or competence or capacity in terms of staff to actually argue back and challenge the developer's proposal. So although viability assessment started as a way of supporting Section 106 negotiations for the local authority to extract what we called surplus profit, and in the early years we did do that quite successfully, we're now in a situation where viability assessments are rather in reverse and actually benefiting the developers more than the local authorities. I mean, that partly came out of changes in government guidance, but in my view, it's something that shouldn't have actually happened. What we've also got is, as I say, this proposition that first homes should be prioritised together with non-housing infrastructure, and therefore there is widespread concern that if Section 106 goes and is replaced by this broader infrastructure levy, that support for affordable housing, especially social rent, will be reduced. Now, the sort of final element of the planning white paper is the issue of public consultation. As I said earlier, there will be consultation on the local plan process, but there is a proposition in the white paper that there will be a simplified examination process. And there's even an indication that that the local authority may be able to kind of self-certify compliance with any national planning guidance, and that you might not need the kind of public examination in planning process at all. Many of us were not happy with both the length and the outcome from the London Plan examination and planning process, and some of you may well have been involved in EIPs for local plans at a borough level. On the other hand, they do give a degree of public scrutiny, and I think there is quite widespread concern that that will be weakened, however much digitization is actually introduced. The white paper does imply that there will be consultation on local design codes. I should stress that kind of local design codes are probably seen as optional, and how you actually consult nationally on a national design code and whether anybody other than urban designers and architects is actually consulted, that I think is going to be a problematic issue. Whether there will be any public consultation before the detailed approvals and what the powers of the local authorities are going to be there, again, is uncertain. But the general view seems to be is that once the local authority has determined the local plan and its zoning and possibly sub areas, that really is the end of the kind of public consultation process, and that you don't need a second stage consultation on individual schemes. The department is really unclear on this, so I may well be wrong, but I think you'll see a lot of the consultation focusing on design concepts and beauty, rather than necessarily on the quality of issues and compliance with space standards and external space standards, and some of the things we've been much more used to. And as I said earlier, the whole issue of who is actually involved. I mean, we are finding clearly that in the lockdown, lots more people are actually participating in seminars of this kind than would necessarily come to a meeting. But whether the reliance or boosting of digitization will lead to more involvement by the individuals in communities as a whole in consultation is unclear. We all know, that some people go to meetings, some people spend their life on Zoom, some people want to get on with their lives and do normal things like earn their money and keep their families going. So there are real issues about whether digitization will actually incorporate in the discussions the wide range of peoples, including, for example, the homeless and those without IT in their accommodation, if they have any. I wanted quickly to comment, however, on what is completely missing from the planning white paper. And this is really the issue of strategic planning, which is of interest to those that work across both London or the wider city region, or in fact any other city regions in the country. There are no provisions for strategic planning whatsoever in the planning white paper. In fact, the planning white paper says that the duty to cooperate, which is one of the soundness tests in the current local plan system, will be removed. It's been obviously problematic in terms of how you judge the duty to cooperate, and many of us, I think, would argue that the legislation was so weak it was a complete failure, and each planning inspector took a different view on what a local authority was required to do to comply with the duty to cooperate. But quite recently, the government recognised this weakness and introduced the requirement for a statement of common purpose prior to a local plan. So each local authority had to produce a statement of agreement with its local authority, which was often about housing numbers, where the housing would actually go, where the housing market was beyond a single authority. So there's nothing in the planning white paper that actually improves this, and in fact would make the situation much, much weaker. Now, given the government is now throwing out these very strange numbers for individual authorities, which have no relationship whatsoever to development capacity in each area, and questionable relationship actually to any sensible assessment of local housing need, there are real impacts on what happens in London. Are these new figures imposed on individual boroughs, irrespective of the targets which are in the existing London plan and the somewhat higher target in the current London plan that may or may not get approval and publication in due course? So there's complete confusion, I think, here, and certainly this is going to be a major issue, not just for boroughs like Kensington and Chelsea, who to achieve their housing targets would basically have to build over the whole of Kensington Gardens and build high-rise development at that, but certainly, as I mentioned earlier, for an out-of-London authority like Sevenoaks. The government, of course, is still holding its Greenbelt protection position, its absolute position, as is the Mayor of London, which raises issues of where do the additional homes go? Do we get more urban intensification? Does this focus on inner London, or is it going to increasingly focus on the lower density estates? And by estates, I mean council estates in suburban London, or how is the housing going to be exported to the home counties? So I think we are going to see, if these government insists on these figures being developed within the specific authority that the target is set, the whole London plan approach to development is really problematic. Many of colleagues in boroughs are actually saying that these figures are so absurd, and undeliverable that they just make a mockery of the government's thinking. But I think it is going to force developers to go back to much more urban intensification, and clearly some of the lower density estates will be part of the framework or the target areas, if that's the appropriate phrase. Now, I was going to try and finish on a more upbeat note, because some of the colleagues I've been talking to say, you know, okay, you're very critical of this. We all think the current planning system isn't working. Surely you should try and be positive. And there are some relatively minor elements within the planning white paper that one would actually support. I'm not going to go through those in detail now, but this is my overall summary, which I included in the book I published 2 or 3 years ago now, of what we actually need for a planning system. So clearly a national spatial plan, which identifies areas for residential employment growth. And in the post-COVID situation, we will be talking, I think, about a very different spatial pattern and less central urban intensification than we've had, because we're talking about very different arrangements between housing and employment location, and a very different position in terms of the capacity or effective capacity of the public transport system. So this is even more urgent than it has been in the past. Local authorities must allocate sites to meet all housing needs, or if they're unable to do so, there needs to be a regional framework, which is my next point, a city regional planning structure to ensure delivery of housing across local authority boundaries, with targets based on joint assessments of needs and capacities. I've been arguing for some years that not only do we need a London-wide system for housing needs assessment and capacity system, which we have to a large extent already, but we need a system across the whole housing market area, the wider city region. And one of the groups I'm very involved in is actually trying to work out proposals for a new statutory planning framework for planning for the London metropolitan region, which must include suburban intensification and urban extensions, but certainly not depend on very hyperdensity and high-rise development in the central area. We certainly need mandatory minimum standards for all new development. We got part of the way there with the pre-existing London plan, but the more and more we move to sort of design concept approaches to standards, the more the basic issues of, you know, space, both internally and externally, and access to services, the weaker the implementation is going to get, especially with the proposals to extend the arrangements on permitted development, which are also in the first consultation paper, which I didn't really mention in any detail earlier. The final point here is one that London Tenants Federation are familiar with, is that we need a definition of affordability which relates to household incomes, not average household incomes, but to the household incomes of the group for whom the housing is intended. So if you're talking about housing provision for low-income groups, it should be no more than 30% of the net household income for low-income groups. That is now, I think, National Labour Party policy, but all the discussions in London about percentages of income seem to be based on averages. And of course, the average income in London is several times the income of the lowest income households. So that's it. So I'm now open to take whatever questions you put on chat and to have a sort of broader discussion later. Thank you.